Dear viewers, welcome to this latest edition of RFE RLive. My name is Abu Bakr Siddiq, and I'm the editor of Gandhara, which is an English language website for Afghanistan and Pakistan. Today we are going to discuss the unfolding situation in Kunduz. After 14 long years, the Taliban finally made a huge comeback and a huge symbolic victory by overrunning a major city in northern Afghanistan. It's a strategic town, Kunduz. The province Kunduz borders Tajikistan, and it's in close proximity with Uzbekistan. To discuss the many aspects of Kunduz crisis, I'm joined by my colleague Farood Bijan, who covers Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iran for our Central News. And then we are joined by Michael Kugelman in Washington. He's a senior program associate for South and Southeast Asia at the Woodrow Wilson Center, a think tank in Washington, D.C. So to begin with, just to give you an idea of how big a development the Taliban, the fall of Kunduz is, Conduce is a city of 300,000 people. Conduce, the province around the city, which is also called Kunduz, is sometimes called as mini Afghanistan because all of Afghanistan's various ethnic groups and tribes, particularly within the Pashtuns, live in Kunduz. It is also considered one of the key provinces or regions central to Afghanistan's economy because it's central to agriculture in Afghanistan, it's central to trade and transport, and one of the earliest industrialization efforts in Afghanistan were also conducted in Kunduz. So to begin the discussion, let's ask Farood, what are the major battlefield developments in Kunduz? What is happening right now?
What is happening right now is that the government forces have managed to take the most strategic key positions or locations in the city, but we're still seeing pockets of resistance by the Taliban. One thing the Taliban have done is retreated to residential civilian areas, and the Afghan army and police, in order to limit the number of civilian casualties, has been wary and very cautious moving forward.
Let's move to Washington and ask Michael. Michael, is Kunduz getting any attention in Washington? We know that Afghanistan has been off the radar for some time, particularly since the departure of most US and NATO troops late last year.
You know, it's really quite extraordinary. There really has been almost a silence about Afghanistan ever since the U.S. combat troop mission ended. Headlines heated up again once the death of Mullah Omar was confirmed a few months back. Certainly, when this Kunduz takeover happened earlier in the week, people did start to talk about it, though quite frankly, you know, soon after news broke of the Kunduz situation, that's when Russia decided to launch its offensives in Syria, and everyone here wants to talk about ISIS. So quite frankly, it's been hard to get a good discussion and debate. But what I am struck by is that the official messaging coming from the U.S. government has been almost like it's a downgrading, even being dismissive of what's going on. It's been referring to, you know, the fall of Kunduz as a setback. And there's been a lot of support expressed for the Afghan government, understandably, from the U.S. government, saying that you know, the U.S. government was perfectly confident that in due course, very soon, Afghan forces would take back Kunduz. So you know, it's very striking how the language coming from the U.S. government has been you know, not at all alarmist, not at all strong, even reassuring. Sense. And that's clearly meant to send a message to the Afghan government and to the Afghan people as well. They don't want to raise undue alarm.
I would like to remind our viewers that they can join this discussion by using the hashtag RFERLIVE on Twitter and Facebook. I also want to remind our viewers that unfortunately Bethany Mata a freelance journalist who has spent most of her year in Kunduz, couldn't join us because of technical problems. So moving forward the discussion, Michael, in your view, what went wrong? Why a major Afghan city that was under tremendous military pressure from the Taliban since the beginning of the year? There was a Taliban attempt back in April to overrun Kunduz. They indeed, in fact, reached to the gates of Kunduz, but they were pushed back. Maybe it was not a major story in Washington, but in Afghanistan, the fighting in Kunduz was constantly in the headlines. So what went wrong? In your view, was it a dramatic development or gradual collapse?
Well, I would argue that it's a little bit of both. I mean, as you said just before, the Taliban has been there, has had a presence there in Kunduz and the surrounding area for quite some time. I mean, even back in 2013, I was seeing reports that the Taliban, and particularly Taliban-affiliated groups like the IMU, the Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, were trying to develop a base in Kunduz. And then, it's really gotten to the point over the last few years that the Taliban has been trying to chip away at the Afghan security forces that are there. They've tried to launch attacks on police posted there to really open an opportunity for them to launch a major offensive, which they were able to do. Now, there are other factors as well. I mean, the Afghan government has essentially outsourced security for Kunduz out to a number of militia groups, and there are all kinds of problems with that, because you simply cannot depend on these groups. A lot of them haven't been paid, and you can't really depend on them to promote security in a way that you would want. But I think at the end of the day, despite the many improvements that the Afghan security forces have made over the last few years, they still suffer from a tremendous number of deficiencies, and one of them being command and control issues, just organizing the troops, so to speak, to be in a position to head off this major offensive. It just was not possible.
Farood, you have been to northern Afghanistan earlier this year, and I'm sure you talked to a lot of people who, of course, describe all the atrocities by the insurgents, which includes a very large number of Central Asians and probably people from North Caucasus, places as far as Chechnya, and also, of course, Pakistanis. But what did you hear about the militias, particularly the militias in Kunduz? Explain a bit in detail who are they and what were their motivations, how they were armed, and what kind of abuses they allegedly committed.
You're talking about, well, the militias in Kunduz, as you mentioned before, that Kunduz is a melting pot in northern Afghanistan. We've seen there are a lot of strongmen, a lot of former warlords, militia leaders in this area. And this turmoil in itself in the north has provided them a chance, an opportunity to fill the vacuum. And we've seen this throughout northern Afghanistan, not just in Kunduz. We've seen it in Balkh, we've seen it in Faryab. And this is one of the real concerns, because as Afghan security forces fail or are struggling to fend off the Taliban, this only empowers these former militias. And as the militias, as we know, the atrocities they committed 20 years ago, decades before, things are happening the same. We're seeing reports of looting, we're seeing reports of extrajudicial executions, but also the Taliban has been heavily involved in this. And I just wanted to make a point here that despite the Taliban claiming a propaganda victory, it was a huge victory for them to get Kunduz. But I also think, and we see this by Mullah Mansour's, the Taliban leader's Eid message, that he told his forces that you should, treat citizens well, treat them with respect. And I think one of the things he wanted to do was show that the first time in 14 years that the Taliban captured a city, that look at us, look how we've changed. And I think that's one of the big things that the Taliban have failed, because obviously they've committed a lot of atrocities there.
Of course, we're going to move to the atrocities part, but let me just stay focused on the failure of the government here. We know that during the past 2 days, the past week, President Ashraf Ghani made sure that he remains at the forefront of the government response. He rarely does press conferences, but this week he has been he's done several press conferences. He also spoke to the elders of Kunduz at length, and he has been very vocal in explaining where the failure has been. He has also responded by appointing a commission to look into the failures. He has fired some people and made new appointments. But we know that since, and this was unfortunately the first anniversary of the national unity government that President Ashraf Ghani leads, and Dr. Abdullah in his role as the chief executive kind of is in charge of all executive affairs. So walk us through some of the failures. I mean, this government, we know, everybody knows that there is a lot of infighting among the within the Afghan unity government. But walk us through some of the problems with the security forces, for instance, with the coordination that led to this fall.
So that's addressed to me, so I'll just weigh in.
Farooq first, and then Michael, you can come in.
Go ahead.
I think obviously this the fall of Kunduz to the Taliban showed the extreme shortcomings of the Afghan security forces. But we also have to remember that there was a lot of mitigating circumstances. The fact that, you know, Afghan forces are fighting without NATO help, especially air power, which has been pivotal. Although we saw some US airstrikes in Kunduz to help the government recapture Kunduz. But the government has a multitude of problems when it comes to the security forces because, first of all, there still isn't a defense minister that's been appointed. We only have an acting defense minister. The other problem is that throughout the country, the government has still failed to fill all the vacant governorship. And we still have 8 governors who have not been appointed. I think there's a big problem with the distribution of forces around the country. I think in the north especially, one of the reasons why the Taliban focused their offensive there was because of the lack of forces there, and they knew that it was a soft underbelly for the government. But I also want to mention that this, the fact that the Afghan forces were able to take Kunduz back so swiftly, I think it does show that there is resilience in the Afghan forces. And I think especially, I think it's noteworthy to talk about the Afghan army's elite forces, who have played a crucial part in the past year, dismantling or foiling a lot of attacks throughout the country. We saw that in Musa Qala in Helmand province, where it fell to the Taliban but swiftly regained by Afghan forces. So I think, despite it being a setback, I think there is cause for optimism here.
Michael, how is Washington looking at this? And we know that Secretary Kerry went to Kabul last year, and it was through his mediation that the Afghan unity government deal was made between 2 election rivals. And we still have this feeling in Afghanistan that the 2 camps are still somehow in the election mode, or at least in the first 6 months they have been in this election modes, and there've been a lot of bickering and fighting about key appointments. That's why we don't have a defense minister, and there have been some disagreements about policy. So how is Washington watching all this? Is Washington worried about the collapse of the national unity government?
Yeah, I mean, Washington is very worried. I don't know if it's worried about the fact that the government, the national government is actually going to collapse. I think what it's really worried about is the situation on the ground in Afghanistan. For the first time in recent days, I've seen U.S. government officials stating on the record that they see similarities between what's happened in Kunduz and what had happened in Mosul and other places in Iraq. recently when ISIS started doing what it's done. And that's a big deal right there. I mean, my own view is that we shouldn't get caught up too much in the analogy with Iraq, because let's not forget that when U.S. troops left Iraq in October 2011, they all left, and there were none left behind. The zero option went into effect right away, whereas, of course, in Afghanistan, there are right now almost 10,000 U.S. troops, and though they played a relatively modest role in helping Afghan troops in Kunduz over the last few years, they did provide support. There were airstrikes. There were a number of, I don't know exactly how many, but there were some U.S. Special Forces working in to advise and help Afghan forces. So that's a big difference there. But I do think that the U.S. government is increasingly concerned about the rapidly destabilizing conditions in Afghanistan. I know that ISIS, the inroads, the potential, the very modest inroads that ISIS has been making in Afghanistan, particularly in Nangarhar province, that is very much on the radar of officials here in Washington. But I think that seeing the Taliban do what it did in Kunduz has really set off a lot of alarm bells in this town. And I think it makes it very clear to officials here that, for all this talk about ISIS concerns, the Taliban is still a threat, because it's the Taliban that took over a major city. ISIS has, of course, done that on numerous occasions in Iraq and Syria, but it hasn't done anything like that in Afghanistan. It doesn't have that kind of presence. So I do think that the phased withdrawal of U.S. troops from Afghanistan, which is meant to really dwindle down to a very small force by the end of this year, I think that the timeline could slow down a bit. I imagine that there are almost 10,000 troops now. I imagine that there's still going to be a fair number of those troops, probably a bit less, but still a fair number of U.S. troops in the country, in Afghanistan, when we come to January 2016.
And staying on this topic, but before I ask you my next question, I would like to remind our viewers that they can join this discussion by posting questions on Facebook or Twitter, and the hashtag is RFERLIVE, RFERLIVE. Michael, do you think that, after all, Afghanistan has been the longest war that the United States has been involved in, and I can sense that there has been, for years, an Afghanistan fatigue in Washington now. But do you think that there can be somehow, apart from the kind of marginal deployment of troops, there can be some decision to increase the troop numbers? And related to this is, how do you think the region is going to respond? We know that there's at least 6,000 to 7,000 Russian troops across the border from Kunduz and other parts of northern Afghanistan and Tajikistan. The Central Asians have made worrying noises about the presence of very large number of militants who mostly are from the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, Ansarullah or Jandullah, but most of these militants basically are Central Asians. And then, of course, we have a small but prominent presence of Chinese Uyghur fighters from Xinjiang, and China has been, in the past couple years, very worried about that, and that's why there was an indication that China wanted to take a lead role in resolving the Afghanistan-Pakistan conflict by pressuring Pakistan to in turn pressure the Taliban to sit down for negotiations or joint negotiations with the Afghan government.
Yeah, well, first getting to your question about U.S. troop levels, I really think that President Obama is trying to pave his legacy, and he wants to be seen as the U.S. president that removed all troops from Afghanistan on his watch. I mean, it's an increasingly difficult thing for him to do in light of what's been happening in Afghanistan. I think it's very unlikely that troop levels will go up. I mean, what I think is more likely is that there are almost 10,000 U.S. troops in the country now. I think instead of bringing that number down significantly by the end of the year, I think the number will come down a bit less. And I don't really know exactly how many will be there next year, but I think it'll be fewer than what's there now. But certainly not more than what's there now, but at the same time, it's not going to be a zero option by the end of the year. Originally, there had been talk about essentially removing all U.S. Troops except for those meant to provide security at embassies and all. That's not going to happen. There are going to be several thousand troops that stay at the least, I'm sure. Now, in terms of the regional implications, all of the militant groups that you mentioned, whether they be the Uyghurs or IMU or whatnot, and there are also there's indications that there are Pakistani militants in the area too, Lashkar-e-Taiba militants, Pakistani Taliban, all of them, every one of them has been emboldened by this Kunduz seizure, even though it hasn't lasted long, even though, as was said, the Afghan troops have done a pretty good job of retaking a good part of the city. The very fact that the seizure happened is huge. It's huge for morale for these militants, many of whom have been struggling with internal divisions within their organizations. The Taliban, both Afghan and Pakistani, have had leadership crises, a lot of fractures. This is a great way to unite all of these different outfits, all of these different militants. And you certainly have to worry that they'll use this short-lived seizure of Kunduz and use it to leverage and springboard into other attacks. Because, as we've discussed, they already have a presence in this neighborhood. So, unfortunately, there's not much good that comes out of this seizure of Kunduz, and even the fact that it was a relatively short-lived seizure. Because I think that these groups are going to be on the offensive, all of them, and they will be emboldened. Their confidence levels are very high.
And Michael, just to follow up on Pakistan, today we saw a statement from the Pakistani Foreign Office that condemned the fall of Kunduz, the seizure of Kunduz by the Taliban in very strong words, and said that the integrity of Afghanistan, territorial integrity of Afghanistan is important for Pakistan, and that Islamabad backs the democratically elected government of Afghanistan. But in recent months, we have seen a breakdown of bilateral relations between Islamabad and Kabul. Building their relationship was perhaps the key foreign policy initiative of President Ghani after resuming office last year. So what is your take? Where are Pakistan-Afghanistan relations going on? And how do you view these Afghan claims that Pakistan is ultimately responsible for the Afghan insurgency, or is behind the Afghan insurgency?
Well, I mean, nothing can be ruled out. I mean, certainly Kunduz is pretty far away from the eastern and southern parts of Afghanistan, where the Taliban has been strongest, and where I think there's perhaps, at least from operational standpoints, easier for Pakistani factions, so to speak, to aid, assist, provide support to Taliban militants. But then again, anything is possible. And I'll say this: I think that it was always going to be a hard sell to have a reconciliation between the Afghans and the Pakistanis for reasons that you both know so well. And I think that when Pakistan, and specifically General, not Prime Minister, General Sharif, tried to reach out to President Ghani in order to come up with some form of cooperation in the hope that Afghanistan would go after Pakistani Taliban militants that Pakistan believes are in Afghanistan, that was all very short-lived, given all of the mistrust in their relationship. I think that many Afghans now will certainly assume that Pakistan was either behind this or was even leading this offensive. I'm not going to endorse either of those views, but the very fact that those perceptions are there, it's going to make it even more difficult for Pakistan and Afghanistan to get back to where they were a few months ago, where you had leaders from both countries talking very seriously about doing things. And I think that there's going to be a major setback. That's not to say that there are not going to be more efforts between President Ghani and General Sharif, and hopefully Prime Minister Sharif, to come up with some sort of reconciliation between the two countries. But more importantly and more realistically, there's a good chance that the two governments will want to talk to try to find ways to resume the peace process between the Taliban the Afghan Taliban and the Afghan government. I think that's more realistic, that they could be looking at that as an angle that they could be engaging. But this is just going to, the Kunduz situation is just going to raise the hostility among a huge expanse of Afghan people, and certainly Afghan government folks. Abdullah, I know, does not share the enthusiasm of President Ghani for engaging the Pakistanis, and it's going to make it it'll make the political climate even more difficult than it already was for Afghanistan to try to reach out to Pakistan and improve relations.
Staying on the political climate question, Farood, what are we seeing in the Afghan political sphere? Has the fall of Kunduz united Afghanistan, or it is revoking memories of the Taliban in the 1990s and perhaps is dividing Afghans?
Well, I think there's a bit of both. I think the fall of Kunduz led to a bit of a witch hunt, if we can use that term. I think there was a lot of people pointing fingers, people like MPs, we're talking about people in the government. There was all sorts of rumors even around the Kunduz governor, the fact that he had fled. Some people were making conspiracy theories that he had colluded with the Taliban. So I think this has illustrated to us the divisions that there are in the government. But I think also when we talk about the Afghan civilian population, I think it has united them. We saw a lot of protests, anti-Taliban protests around the country, and Afghans showing solidarity with the Afghan forces. And I think especially the crimes and the violence that was committed in Kunduz by the Taliban, I think it showed to the Afghan populace that this hardline regime or this hardline group hasn't changed, and the country has outwon it.
And what about, you were talking about the Taliban messaging. I mean, initially they said that they will be kind, and when they in fact first took over Kunduz, they went into mosque and used the loudspeakers there to tell the population, the people, to continue their life as normal, and even urge the shopkeepers to go back to their shops and businesses. But we now know that there were a number of abuses. Amnesty International has come up with a very strong statement. So in your view, are the Taliban 2.0 any different from the Taliban in the 1990s? That's you.
And I think as soon as the Taliban took Kunduz, I think we saw images of Taliban taking selfies, being warmly embraced by the citizens there, and I think the Taliban used it as propaganda. And there was even voices coming out of Kunduz that some parts of the population had in fact welcomed them because of bad governance, because of rife corruption in the provincial government. But then very quickly we saw that there had been a lot of things committed there by the Taliban. We were hearing from our own correspondent and others in Kunduz that the Taliban were going door to door looking for government employees, looking for Afghan security forces, harassing people, executing people on the street. And one of the things also was that one of the first things the Taliban did in Kunduz was burn down a radio station that was run by women. And of course that instilled a lot of fears, or brought back a lot of those fears that especially women have about the reemergence of the Taliban.
This is a live discussion on RFE. You can participate in this discussion by using the hashtag RFERLIVE on Facebook and Twitter. This recording will also be on our website and also on our YouTube channel. Michael, in your way, what is the way forward? What is Washington learning any lessons from this? Are we going to see any coordinated international response?
Well, I'm not sure we will. I mean, other than the fact that there were international troops that were helping out with the recovery of Kunduz. I think that one question to think about here about looking forward, setting aside the issue of troop levels, is whether the U.S. will decide to change the terms of engagement for its troops that remain in Afghanistan. I mean, as you both know, for now, all U.S. troops in Afghanistan are in a non-combat role. They're meant to be providing advice, training, moral support, etc. to Afghan forces, and they're also given the opportunity to engage in limited counterterrorism operations when the need arises. And U.S. rules of engagement are governed by the need to be seen as providing support only when they are directly threatened. So, in other words, the U.S. military has to cast its role and its activities in Afghanistan really as defensive. Now, of course, that's very limiting, and if those rules of engagements were not in place, if they were more flexible, if they were more broad, then conceivably, U.S. troops could be doing more in an operational combat sense than they have been in Kunduz and elsewhere over the last few months. Politically in the U.S., it's very difficult to do something like that because one of the big ideas for the Obama administration, one of the big priorities, was to remove as many troops as possible out of the country and ensure that those there are in less danger and not in a position to die. This political opinion has been pushing for this for quite some time. So I'm not sure that'll happen, but you have to wonder if the issue of rules of engagement could change a bit. And if you want to talk about moving forward, I think that we also need to acknowledge that the Obama administration is not going to be around much longer. There's a presidential campaign deep in play right now, and if we don't know if the next U.S. president, whoever that may be, whether from the Democratic Party, from Obama's party, or from the Republican Party, if there'll be differences, if there'll be changes. I mean, quite frankly, none of the presidential candidates have said much at all about Afghanistan. But you wonder if a Republican becomes president, if there will be more sympathy from a Republican president, more sympathy to the U.S. military's suggestions that the phased withdrawal be slowed down, that more troops be in the country. That we just don't know about. But, my final word on this is moving forward, there's certainly things that the U.S. can do to help, but I think you really have to go back to Afghanistan and the Afghan government. And I would highlight what Faroud said before, that this is a government that has so much on its plate. It has an emboldened insurgency, it has an economic situation which is in big trouble, and yet it cannot achieve very basic tasks of governance, such as filling out a cabinet, including a defense minister. So given those very basic fundamental challenges, it's hard to imagine that this government, which incidentally, of course, is led by two guys that don't really get along, how can you expect them to really push forward and take the really big steps that need to be taken, such as dealing with this insurgency? It's a very big concern.
Faroud, one final question for you. What are the likely scenarios that we're going to see in the coming couple weeks? Are we going to see full government control established over Condos?
I believe so. It looks like it will take, I think, several more days for the government to get full control of Kunduz. But I think the bigger problem here is, and I wanted to touch upon what Michael also said, is most of the problems, the security problems in the country, are not just attributed to the Afghan security forces, who have been heavily criticized for all their shortcomings. I think a lot of it has to do higher up inside the government. As we mentioned before, the cabinet issues, that's one of the first things they have to address. They have to address the fact that there's a lot of these operations by the government have not gone well because of poor planning, because of disorganization, because of intelligence failures. I think the government really has to start back into the basics and work forward there, because otherwise, as Michael said, an emboldened Taliban and insurgency will only test the government further.
Michael, a few last words.
Well, I mean, I think that the bottom line here is very simple. that we now know, as if we needed to know, we now know that the Taliban insurgency is very much alive. There has been a lot of talk about how it was a divided party, that it was fractured, that you know, it had become more of a drug syndicate than a fighting force. You know, this is all clearly not true. And I think we now know that it is a national, it is a bona fide, the Taliban is a bona fide national threat. It is not a localized nuisance. I mean, it is a big deal. And I think that with, here in Washington, all of the talk really focused on ISIS and the threat that that poses in Afghanistan. I think it's made people forget that the Taliban is a very real threat. It stages attacks all the time, and it's doing things in Afghanistan that ISIS has been doing elsewhere. And I wish that, you know, those types of considerations would figure more in the U.S. presidential campaign. In Afghanistan, even though many Americans want to forget about it, you know, they think of Afghanistan as out of sight, out of mind. We can't afford to forget about Afghanistan. And I do hope that, that there'll be more of a debate on that on the presidential campaign trail here, and also within the halls of power. I just think there needs to be a bigger and a louder conversation about Afghanistan.
Michael, we have just received a question from one of our viewers on Twitter, and it says that will the fall of Kunduz bring Russia closer to Afghanistan?
Yeah, I mean, that certainly is something that I've been thinking about, and I think a lot of us have been thinking about. My sense is that it certainly will not hurt, because Russia has always shared a lot of similar interests with Afghanistan. Russia, for a very long time, has been very concerned, very specifically, about the drug trade in Afghanistan, given that there's a huge heroin epidemic in Russia, and most of these drugs come from Afghanistan. And the more the country, the more Afghanistan is destabilized, the more it strengthens the drug trade and the drug epidemic. So I think that, you know, that reason alone will bring the Russians and the Afghans together a lot more. Now, that said, Russia, of course, has a whole lot on its plate, given what it's dealing with in its neighborhood, other parts of its neighborhood, and also given this decision that it just made to start launching an offensive in Syria against ISIS. I'm not saying that, you know, Russia's going to reach out to Afghanistan in the hopes that they could become the best of friends, but certainly I think that you know, there already are shared interests between these two countries, and I think that they'll become even more amplified given the aftermath of the Kunduz offensive.
With that, Michael, thank you for your participation. Farouk, thank you very much for your input and for walking us through the many complexities that makes the crisis of Conduce in the aftermath of the fall of Conduce. I also want to thank our viewers for watching this episode of RFE RLive. Thank you.